go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all tonight. I'm so glad you could take time out of your evening and join me. Let's go through, this is going to be our agenda for this evening. And I know there are people here who have all different backgrounds. Some of you have probably no knowledge about redistricting or gerrymandering. Others may be very, very knowledgeable. So just bear with me. We're going to go through the basics to start. What is redistricting? What is gerrymandering? Who does it? When is it done? Why is it done? How is it done? What are the factors that influence redistricting? How does gerrymandering affect that? And then I'd like to talk about redistricting reform, why we think we need it, what we think we can do to improve the redistricting process, and then how we do it. I'll try to give you a little bit of an update on the state and national things that are happening. There's a lot going on at the federal level right now, and I don't know that we're going to have enough time to talk about it, but I'll at least give you information, and then you can seek additional information at the resources that I suggest. And also, I want to spend some time talking about specific suggestions for citizen action. And I'd like to have you hold your questions until the end, if you would. So if you have a paper and pencil, you might want to write them down so that you don't forget them as we're talking and going through this, because we're going to try to cover a lot of information. I'm hoping, if I can stick to a schedule, to end at 8:30, and have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. If we've got a lot of interest in keeping the discussion going, I'm happy to stay another 15 minutes or until the library kicks us out, which is usually about 8:45. So let's start with what is redistricting. Well, very simply, the redistricting is just the drawing of these state and legislative boundaries, our voting district boundaries. It takes place every 10 years after the census, based on the national census, and the next census will take place in 2020. So that means we'll be drawing the lines in the 2021 legislative session. Now, I'm going to keep this real simple, as I said. So when we talk about congressional seats, we're talking about the federal representatives. These are the people who represent you in Washington. And the US House, which is Congress, has 435 seats, and they are divided among the 50 states. Each state gets one representative, and then the balance of the representatives are distributed proportionate to our population. So currently, Indiana, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but currently Indiana has 9 congressional districts. So, and everybody has 2 senators, each state. So we have in Indiana 2 senators for the entire state, and then we have 9 congressional districts currently. We used to have 11 districts in Indiana, but with the population change, the proportionate population change, we now have 9. So of course, once the census is done in 2020, that could change again. Now, that was talking about our federal representation in the Congress in Washington. Now we're talking about the Indiana state representation. And we have 50 Indiana Senate seats, or districts. We have 100 Indiana House districts. Now, there are only 2 federal requirements for redistricting, because the states are responsible. Each individual state sets up their own redistricting process. And they only have 2 things that come down from the federal level that, which they are mandated to comply with. One is that the districts that are designed and drawn have to be of equal population. And this is pretty close in equal population. The second thing is that all of the district divisions must comply with the Voting Rights Act. So there cannot be any discrimination by race or ethnicity or language. So try to remember that, because that's going to be important later. Those are the only 2 requirements required by the federal government at this time. So as I mentioned, excuse me, the states are the ones responsible for the redistricting. So who draws the lines? That depends on the state. And there's a lot of variability throughout the United States, and it's changing almost literally by the day. I had to update and update and update my PowerPoint because it continues to change. Some states, very few, have fully independent commissions. A number of them also have bipartisan commissions. Iowa has a nonpartisan government agency. And remember, these commissions are the people, the institutions that draw those boundary lines. Most of the states, I think right now, if I'm current, it's about 37 states, have the state legislature that draws these district boundaries. And that is the case in Indiana too. Technically, though, we are considered a combination system. But I say technically because it only applies to our congressional districts. And that's on the bottom here. I'm going to talk about that briefly, but I think for most people, it's just going to be easier to think and remember that for the most part, our state lines are drawn by our state legislature. And again, the state legislature draws these congressional and state districts once per decade. The governor does have veto power over any proposed plan. He or she has to do that within a 7-day period. Now, this is the technical part that if you're interested in, it's interesting to know, but you really don't have to focus on it very much. If the state legislature is unable to complete just the federal congressional redistricting. Now, remember, those are the people that go to Washington. Those are the 9 congressional districts. It only applies to that. If they are unable to complete the redistricting for that within the first session, then and only then it's done by a 5-member commission. Okay? But that does not apply, I should say, for the state districts. Okay? This doesn't get used very often. Actually, I think it occurred once in the 90s. If anybody remembers, they can help me with the date. But and as you can see, if you look at that 5-member commission, it basically winds up being the majority party doing it anyway, because it's the Speaker of the House, the President pro tem of the Senate, the Chair of the Senate. They're all going to be majority party members. So, okay. Now, I mentioned the 2 federal requirements, equal population and adherence to the Voting Rights Act. That's all that's required at the federal level, but there are many other nonpartisan redistricting principles, and many other states use these in their state constitutions and in their redistricting commissions. So I'm going to describe them to you, and then we'll look at Indiana. Excuse me. The first possibility, the first principle is compactness. And I'm going to show you some pictures that will illustrate this better, but basically this is keeping the population density as compact as possible. Now, some people make the mistake of thinking that this is just in reference to shape of the district. And I've even had a lot of people say to me, man, I know that one's gerrymandered because look at it, you know, it's all crooked. That's not necessarily true. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But at any rate, compactness is a good principle to try to follow. We don't have any such requirement in Indiana. So that's something we could consider, but we don't have it now. Contiguity or contiguous, that is the only requirement that we do currently have here in Indiana. And all that means is that the land mass within the district needs to be connected. So for instance, if you have a lake here, you can't have half your district here and half your district here and nothing connecting it. Okay, so that's all that means. It has to be contiguous. The land mass has to be contiguous. So we do have that requirement. That is currently the only requirement for Indiana. A lot of states require statewide partisan balance between the 2 parties. Indiana has no provisions to encourage this. And then the next one, communities of interest. What that refers to are, they're people within a community that have common interests. It might be a minority group, it might be a small farming community, but it's a community of interest. And ideally, we like to see those communities maintained intact within a district. Because if they're not, the voices get diminished, the voices of those voters, and their needs may not be met. Another redistricting principle is nesting. And that's just kind of what it says. If you think of those nesting boxes or the nesting dolls, that's basically what this is. So if you remember, we have 100 House seats in the state, and we have 50 Senate seats. So ideally, it would be nice if we had 2 of the House seats within that Senate seat. And that would mean that all the people in that district have the same senator. So now we have some continuity in representation. So nesting is a good principle, and we like to adhere to that if we can. Indiana does not have any nesting requirement. Another one is incumbent residency. And what we want to see here is blindness, no consideration of incumbent residency, because we feel, and a good redistricting principle is, you don't draw a district based on the incumbent's address. That should be irrelevant. We do not have any requirement in Indiana to prohibit that. The last one is transparency and public input, also a very critical redistricting principle. We want the process of drawing these boundaries, these lines, to be very transparent, open to the public. We want there to be public input into the drawing of these boundaries. We've got a lot of smart people, and they're not all in the legislature. And they may have some brilliant ideas on how to redistrict. They should be able to have access to that process. They should be able to see that process. It should be open to everybody. And we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but we're going to talk about a case right now before the Supreme Court where their districts were literally drawn behind closed doors by the majority party. So transparency is really important. Okay, let's talk about gerrymandering. What is it? There's the literal definition. It is the practice of manipulating the voter district boundaries, and it's done deliberately to give political advantage to a particular party or a particular individual, and usually it's a particular party. The name came up back in 1812. It was named for Governor Elbridge Gerry, and it was actually pronounced Gary, although it got changed. Who in 1812, he signed a redistricting plan, and it was designed to protect basically his party's control in the Massachusetts State Senate. Once that was done, there was a journalist and artist who added a tail and a salamander head, and that's where the term gerrymandering came from, because it looked like a salamander and it was dubbed a gerrymander. Okay, how do we gerrymander? Well, this is one way. We can crack the districts. And this is a real simplistic way of looking at it, but let's say you've got 100 people in each one of these squares, and that's a compact district. But what we can do is we can crack them. We can draw those lines to break that community apart. So that's an example that we call cracking. It's a very commonly used gerrymandering technique. A second technique is called packing. And that's basically the opposite. So you can see how this was divided initially, but look what happens when you pack the blues. And now the reds have the advantage in 4 districts. So if you were voting, you would have a lot of excess votes in that packed district. They would have way more votes than they needed. But the outlying 4 would go for the red, even though the distribution wasn't really that different. And I don't know if any of you are fans of John Oliver, but I am. And there's a reference on your reference sheet. And I just have to use his analogy because I think it's the best one I've ever heard to describe cracking and packing. And what he came up with, and I just love it, is imagine that you've got some really obnoxious relatives or friends, and you're having a wedding reception, and you have to figure out where are you going to seat these people. So you have 2 choices. You can take them, and you can pack them, and you can put them in the table in the corner, and you can hope that they, stay out of the main flow of the reception, and you can contain them. The other option is you can put 1 at each table and split them up, and then what you're hoping, is that their damage can be controlled because they'll be split up. That, I think, is just a great explanation of cracking and packing. I love his analogy. I think it's better than anything else I've heard. There's another technique, it's not used as often, it's called tacking. And this is basically just bringing in an extra piece of the district. This is almost always used for incumbency. Okay, this is a visual guide. This is gerrymandering explained 3 different ways, and we're going to divide 50 people into 5 districts. So here are our 50 people. We've got 60% blue and 40% red. Now, if we had a perfect representation in our districts, it would look like this. 60%, so that would be, 3 blue. 40% would give us 2 reds, and the blues would win. Okay, that's perfect. Perfect districting, redistricting. The next one, those districts are compact. They have a nice shape, they're nice rectangular shape. But look what happens. They're very much favoring the blue districts. What technique have they used here? Is that packing or is that cracking? What did they do with those blue voters? They packed them. This is an example of packing. Let's take a look at this one now, neither compact nor fair. Now look at the lines and look what happened to those blue districts. What happened to them now? They got cracked. Sounds obscene, but they got cracked. And now we've got 2 blue districts, 3 red districts, and red wins. And yet, here was the vote count. Here is the distribution. And here's the ramifications of gerrymandering. And here's our perfect district, which is, of course, what we would like. I want you to particularly pay attention to the compact district because we're going to talk a little bit later about things that happened in Indiana last year. And one of the things that came up in this discussion about what should be done in Indiana is the fact that we were cited as being our congressional districts were cited as being extremely compact, which is normally a very good thing. And that was cited as a reason in the meeting that I'm going to talk about, as a reason why we don't need redistricting reform. And that's why I wanted to show you this, because districts can be compact and still be unfair. So we have to look at the big picture. We have to look at all the principles of redistricting. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the adverse effects, and we're going to look at a little video here too later. But what's the problem with gerrymandering? It allows the representatives to pick their voters, basically, instead of us being able to pick our representatives. One of the things that happens is you get less competition, because now you've got a safe district. If that majority party has a safe district, it's pretty hard to get the minority party to get anybody to run. And think about that. Why would they? It costs a lot of money to run a campaign. It takes a lot of time. So, I hear people saying, well, there aren't any good candidates. If that party can't get any good candidates. Well, there's a reason why they can't get good candidates, and it's a very logical one. So you get reduced competitions and you get safe districts. You get lack of competition that discourages voting then, because people actually very logically say, why bother? We know what the outcome is going to be, so why bother to vote? It protects the party in power. And these partisan districts also become very polarized, and that discourages compromise. One of the things we see happening is that because there's no competition, we tend the primaries tend to become the general election, because remember, there's no opposition. So now it becomes the primary candidates of that majority party. And unfortunately, what that tends to encourage are the more extreme views, because these candidates know they don't have to really moderate. They aren't going to have to deal with the minority population at all because they've got a safe district. So some people will say to me, well, I'm a member of the majority party, which in Indiana is the Republican Party. And they'll say, I want my party to win. I want those candidates to win. But what you need to think about if you have that opinion is that you are not getting represented adequately either, because you're not getting a choice within your own party, because you tend to get tremendous polarization. The last disadvantage of gerrymandering is these communities of interest that we discussed can be disadvantaged and splintered and broken up. So their voices are diminished. Okay, here's some specific impacts that gerrymandering has had in Indiana, in our own state. You remember I talked about when there's no competition, it discourages voting. Well, Indiana had the worst voter turnout in the country in the 2014 elections. We were right around 28%. And coincidentally, that same year, the University of Chicago study found that the Indiana House districts were the 5th most gerrymandered in the country. And that's based on a relatively new objective measurement called the efficiency gap, which we'll talk about a little bit more if we have time. Another thing of significance, we had 44 out of 100 races for state rep and 10 out of 25 races for the state senate that were completely uncontested by the major party in 2014. Now, granted, 2014 was not a presidential election year. And our rate of voter turnout did go, it was over 50%. But, you know, think about that. 28% in 2014, 50-something, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a little bit over 50. That's pretty dismal. That's a really poor turnout. That means that in 2014, 28% of those voters determined what the future was going to be for everybody. And that is not even necessarily 28% of the registered, or the, excuse me, yeah, that's 28% of the registered voters, not necessarily 28% of people who were eligible, because some people don't register to vote. So it's even really worse than 28%. Okay, last one I'm going to mention. In Indiana, Republicans generally win 53 to 50% of the votes in state legislative races. And this is a quote, but they've drawn the maps with such surgical precision that they now find themselves in 71 and 80% of the seats, and we're talking about the House and Senate, respectively. Now, this, again, remember, is the state legislature. These are the people in Indianapolis. I want to keep clarifying that, because I do find as I do these talks that people get confused between the federal and the state. So that is a quote, but I did check the information, and it's accurate. So I get this a lot. We've always had gerrymandering pegged. You know that. What are we going to do about it? What's different? What's the big deal? It's been going on since 1812, remember, and actually a little bit before that. Well, there's a lot that's changed since 1812, because now we're in 2017. And I love this quote, except I can't remember where I got it. I think it's from the Brennan Center. I hate not giving credit, but I've forgotten. Gerrymandering was once an art, but now it's a science. Because we have many more powerful software programs that can just very, very easily and readily divide up populations by demographics now. They can easily pull socioeconomic status, your party membership or affiliation. That can be pulled out much more precisely now than it used to be. And that has accelerated. And you can see that when you look at the maps and the districts throughout the entire United States, that this has worsened. This problem has worsened, and it's accelerating in its worsening. And the other issue, which is a hot one right now, is that up until now, and currently, there is no acceptable objective judicial standard. There's no law that says you can't gerrymander in a partisan way. So that's a problem. That's a problem. We have the law that prohibits gerrymandering by discrimination, but we don't have anything that says that you can't do partisan redistricting. There's nothing that stops our major parties from being able to do that. And believe me, they both do it, both Democrats and Republican parties. At any rate, this is a Wisconsin lawsuit. And it is, in this case, against the Republicans who have a trifecta in Wisconsin. And this is the one that I mentioned where they actually drew the maps, the majority party, which in this case was the Republican Party. They literally went behind closed doors and drew the maps in secret. There were no minority party members allowed in the rooms. So they were sued, and the state of Wisconsin the legislature lost at the district level, and it is now in the Supreme Court. The arguments began October 3rd, and we will have to wait and see what happens. But the important part about this is this lawsuit introduced an objective measure, an objective metric called the efficiency gap. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'll summarize it as quickly as I can. What we're talking about when we talk about the efficiency group is these statisticians, mathematicians, some really bright people, looked at what's called, they call them wasted votes. I actually hate that term. I prefer excess votes. So what they did is they took the loser of the election, let's say, and all of the votes that went to the party that lost, let's call it the minority party, the one that lost, all of those votes that went for them are considered excess votes. Then they looked at the winner, the majority party. And you know, when you only need 50% plus one vote to win an election. So any votes that were beyond that were excess in that election for that majority party. And then they put those together. They looked at the Republicans and the Democrats, and they compared the excess votes. Okay? And then they look at a ratio, and if that ratio is, if there's a huge gap, that is indicative of extreme gerrymandering. And there are standards for that. And I don't want to go into much more detail because most of you may not even be very interested in it. But again, and I think I forgot to mention this in the beginning, please write questions down as we're going along. And if there are specific areas like this that you want to discuss later in more depth, you know, note that. And if we have time, we will do that. But I'm going to have, oh, what happened? I have to apologize. I have severe arthritis in my hands, and they do weird things sometimes. I must have hit the button. Okay, so I'm going to skip over and go to just briefly touch on these. These are two other cases that will be going before the Supreme Court. One is Benesek v. Lamone, and this one is against the Democrats for packing a district in Maryland. And that one is probably on stay until something happens with the Gill v. Whitford. The Harris versus Cooper, I don't even want to try to get into a discussion about North Carolina because this has been going on since 2011. There are multiple lawsuits going on. Only one has been resolved. They, again, in this case, the majority party is the Republicans, and they gerrymandered and they broke the law. They very definitively broke the law because theirs was a racial discrimination gerrymander. So they were sued, and after they were sued, then they drew new maps. And this just blows me away, but they did this, they deliberately tried to maintain control, and they said so. They said, we're going to do this again, we're going to maintain the same imbalance, but we're going to do it on a partisan basis now, rather than a racial basis. And they're on tape. I mean, there was no hiding of any of this. This was done very overtly, very openly, because there's no law against partisan gerrymandering. So we've got a number of cases going on there, and I'm not going to go in. The racial gerrymandering case has been resolved at the Supreme Court level, and those maps have been determined to be racially gerrymandered, and that's done. Those are thrown out. But the case against them for partisan gerrymandering is still to continue. And now I think there's a new suit from Common Cause has a suit against them. I think the League of Women Voters now also has, and those are in district court. So stay tuned. I'm not going to talk any more about them because it would take all night. So there's just a lot going on, but I do want to emphasize both parties gerrymander. And I put the Maryland one in there deliberately because this is not a one-party issue. The Democrats have done it, the Republicans have done it. That's why we need independent districts. We need to save them from themselves, I think. Okay, I did want to mention this because I was really interested when I saw this. It's a 30-page amicus brief. I hope I'm pronouncing it right again now, for Gill v. Whitford. This is how Supreme Court cases work. You have the main plaintiffs and defendants in the main case, but then you also can have other groups and other individuals who can also chime in, so to speak. And this is a group of bipartisan congressmen members. And I'm going to read you what it says. What our political system needs now, what the problem of extreme partisan gerrymandering needs now, are basic boundaries so that our parties can begin to correct course and mend the broken parts of our political process. The court should give the nation that chance. And I want to point out something. These, if you look through, and you may not even be able to read it, I'm not sure. I put them all on here. The current chair of the Freedom Caucus is on this list. Now, caucuses are groups of legislators who gather together and they form a group. They have similar interests and they promote similar things. The Freedom Caucus is well known to be a very conservative Republican caucus. And look what we have here, the former chair of the Progressive Caucus. And if you've heard of the Progressive Caucus, that's known to be a very left Democratic caucus. And I thought that was fascinating when I saw that. And what this is telling me, my interpretation of this, is we're reaching a tipping point. And I don't know if anybody's a Gladwell fan, Malcolm Gladwell, if you ever read any of his books. My son turned me on to him many, many years ago, but he has some wonderful books. One is called Tipping Point. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend it. But basically what I'm talking about when I say tipping point is I think the momentum is building. And that's why I say I think people who are still fighting it are going to be on the wrong side of history. We've got a lot of momentum coming at the state levels and at the federal level. Okay, we've got Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, working with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, working together for support of getting away from gerrymandering. Governor Schwarzenegger, Ohio Governor Kasich, again, two Republicans, presidents from both parties, Kennedy, Reagan, Bush, Obama, they've all spoken out against gerrymandering. And this is not an entire list. And there were many, many other amicus briefs. I just threw this one in, the one that I just talked about, because I was so interested in seeing the two caucus members on it. I thought that was significant enough to throw another slide in here. Okay, here's my gerrymander video.
It's common these days for voters to feel frustrated, to feel as if legislators aren't paying attention to them. Legislative seats nationwide are less competitive than they used to be, and one big reason why is gerrymandering. Voters have chosen to arrange themselves in cities and towns, in rural areas, and then legislators take that natural pattern and draw the lines as they like to suit themselves. A major problem is partisan gerrymandering, drawing a whole pattern of districts to suit one whole political party. Redistricting happens every 10 years. This leads to a situation in which close to 100 seats in Congress are less competitive than they would be otherwise. Intuitively, we think about gerrymandering as centering around weird-shaped boundaries, right? Strangely shaped boundaries that are crooked, that have funny bumps and valleys and so on. It turns out that's not such a great way to define a gerrymander. Because voters tend to live in communities of like-mindedness, imagine a city that is mostly Democrats and imagine it surrounded by a community of voters who are mostly Republicans distributed over space. It is possible to creatively draw lines where we can pack the Democrats in one district, for instance, by drawing a boundary that encompasses most of the Democrats in a single, nicely circularly shaped district, and then distributing the remaining Democrats over remaining districts so that in the end the Republicans get an overwhelming advantage. You can take the same map and do the opposite. You can take this nice cluster of voters in the center and now take wedges out of that center city and now create pie slices, and the first bite of each pizza slice will then be just enough to make that slice a secure win for Democrats. Therefore, it's possible to draw lines to make it either running the table for Republicans or running the table for Democrats, depending on what legislators want. So what's left is to come up with some standard where gerrymandering can be defined without reference to maps. And it turns out there's a tool available. The idea is to invoke the idea of partisan symmetry. If one side has 75, 80% of the vote in district after district, that side has been packed. When one side wins in landslides, but the other side's wins are closer, the question arises, did this overall pattern occur incidentally, as if by chance or by nonpartisan means? If not, then we would conclude that one side's voters were packed more than the others, as if on purpose. It turns out that this is the easiest thing that you can test. In all the sciences and all of engineering, the most widely used test is something called student's t-test. And it was made possible by this guy, William Gossett. Gossett lived in the early 20th century. He was chief experimental brewer of the Guinness Company in Ireland. And Gossett had this problem of how to tell whether hops quality was good. And he was very pleased about this. And he said, okay, I would like to publish this. And his lab notebook said, Student's Laboratory Notebook. And he had a bit of a sense of humor, and he said, oh, I'm a student. And so to this day, it's called Student's t-test. The t-test compares two averages. Here, the two averages are of the winning vote share in Democratic districts and the winning vote share in Republican districts. The t-test asks whether two averages are different enough that they are unlikely to have arisen incidentally from nonpartisan mechanisms. For example, redistrictors want to draw straight-ish boundaries. They want to honor communities of interest. They want to follow other rules that are set down in law. And for those reasons, averages can sometimes be a little bit different, advantaging one side or the other side. What the t-test asks is that difference so large that it could not have arisen incidentally? And if that's the case, then what we have is a likely gerrymander. A great example of partisan asymmetry that can be detected using the t-test is North Carolina. 2010 was a wave election for the Republicans. And with their new control over the redistricting process, they created an advantage for themselves. It was a perfect inversion of what had happened previously. Democrats ended up with 4 congressional districts and Republicans ended up with 9 congressional districts, despite the fact that Democratic candidates won more votes that year. This pattern was repeated in 2014 and 2016, and in each case, the vote was reasonably closely split, but in each case, the Democrats won more lopsided wins. And the t-test tells us that this difference between Democratic wins and Republican wins could not have arisen by chance. There's overwhelming public opinion against gerrymandering and a general sense that it ought to be addressed. And there are two ways. One is through courts and the other is by activists. Courts could say, we will define gerrymandering as violation of partisan symmetry. Are the two parties being treated fairly and equally? And if they're not, then there's partisan asymmetry. And the Supreme Court has expressed some willingness to do that. Another route is for activists. Voters have started to pass fair districting laws. The risk is that they may leave loopholes by not thinking ahead and realizing that in fact there's still the possibility of partisan asymmetry. So writing into the law something like a simple statistical test, like the t-test, would close that last loophole. Here's an opportunity to make the democratic process work a little bit better. If this effort succeeds, what we're going to end up with is the situation that the founders envisioned. The voters pick their legislators and not the other way around.
Now what he's talking about, the t-test, what they're looking at is the difference between the mean and the median. So look at these resources for additional information. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail. You've got them in front of you. I'll try to make a few comments. If you get out your pens, I've got a couple more because, of course, as soon as I had them printed, I had about 4 more that I thought, oh, darn, why did I put that on there? So the Brennan Center, there's all kinds of great stuff through the Brennan Center. And what I want to mention in particular with the Brennan Center is the State of Redistricting Litigation. They have a monthly edition that comes out each month. And if you get on the email list, you will get a monthly summary. And they look at all the redistricting litigation that's going on throughout the country. So get on that list, and you'll get that every month. The last one is from September, but it will be updated each month. Then the Princeton Project. And I didn't talk about, if you scroll down, or if you look down at Harris v. Arizona, you might be interested in looking at that if you're really into these court cases, because that's where Arizona is one of the few states that has an independent redistricting commission, and then and that was established by a constitutional amendment, and it succeeded and it passed, and then the legislature went back and sued again against this measure. They lost at the Supreme Court. Anyway, that's an interesting one. Please go to our League of Women Voters websites. I've got the national one, the state one, the local one. We also have a real good useful resources PDF on there. We're going to be talking a little bit about what you can do. And on our website, we have something called Redistricting House Parties, Making Democracy Work. And that will give you instructions on a type of advocacy, by doing parties, having people come to your house, having a good time, and talking about redistricting reform. We also hope that you will support the library's local WELT radio station at 95.7. We do a bi-monthly show, the League of Women Voters does. And back in September, Barb and Lucy and I did one on gerrymandering, so you might want to check that out. Common Cause is another good center, or another good source. The Campaign Legal Center, that's the one that I mentioned before, that you really want to go on that one and check out. It's called Gerrymandering Poll Release at the National Press Club Video. If you want to know anything about Gill v. Whitford, that's a great resource. And then please support our newspaper, both, well, the Sentinel and the Journal-Gazette. And I just put in just local articles that some of us did. Please check those out. There is a gerrymandering YouTube. That's the one with John Oliver that I mentioned, which I love. And then there is also another movie. It's called Play to Pay, Democracy's High Stakes. Here are the ones that you can add that I like. There is actually a SCOTUS blog, SCOTUS, and that's the Supreme Court of the United States. And they are, of course, the ones that are hearing these cases. So you can go right into this blog and listen and see all the arguments, and it's really fascinating. Another one that I love is ballotpedia.org. It is, they call it the Encyclopedia of Politics, and it's excellent, excellent website. And it's Ballotpedia, B-A-L-L-O-T-P-E-D-I-A, ballotpedia.org. Two other really good sites, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. They have some wonderful, wonderful material. In fact, I just ordered a couple. They have a legislative directory that is just packed with information. It has color photos. It has all the districts' maps for each legislator. They're all updated all the time. They have legislator biographies, photos, contact information. They give all the committee assignments, updated seating charts. You name it, it's on there. The 2018 one will be coming out in January, but you can get a PDF on the 2017 one. So that's there. They also have here is your Indiana government. Lots and lots of good information there. And the other one I'd like to recommend is the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities, which is www.in.gov/G as in go, P as in peg, C as in cat, P as in peg, O, L. Okay, so GPCPOL. www.in.gov/GPCPD. I should have had a whiteboard where I could write these down or something. I'm sorry. Okay, the other thing that is on your sheet are three other wonderful websites. We're actually going to get into my favorite one at the end of this, assuming I get to it. Go into www.usa.gov. You can get all your national information. And I put the Allen County one on here also. Allen County has a really good website. You can go in and you can find all kinds of information about committees and your school districts, the county council, everything that's happening on the county council. There is a lot of good information online. And what I'd like to suggest to everybody is, give up Twitter, give up video games, get on these websites. They are addictive. You will learn so much. I mean, it's really exciting. Of course, I tend to be obsessive, but you get on them and you learn. I mean, you click onto this and it's, wow, I didn't know that existed. So it's really fun. The one I love the most and that I want you to memorize is iga.in.gov, and that's the state one. That's Indiana General Assembly .in, Indiana.gov. Okay. And we're going to get into that later. Now, the problem with this is I need it strapped to me or something, so I keep it with me when I move. Okay, let's talk about citizen action. But before I do, I want to backtrack just a minute because I realized I should have probably said this earlier. You know, when we were talking about last year, the state legislative session, what I didn't mention is what's happening this year, in this year's legislative session. So we talked about what happened in the state last year. We talked about what happened at the national level. I'm now backtracking to talk about the state and what's happening going forward. And actually, there are no bills going forward at this point because our legislature has what's called an organization day, and that will be in November. Unfortunately for us, it hasn't occurred yet. And no bills can be introduced into the legislature until organization day. So there are really no specific bills that we can recommend you take action on, but I will have an action for you right at the end. But what happens is the legislators, these committees, they have interim committees that meet over the summertime, and they do research, and they start planning and thinking and writing, and they do all the work, the prep work, to get to those bills. But the bills can't be introduced until after organization day. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later. So what can you do? Pay attention to the census and to the redistricting process. That's the first thing. And you've already done a lot of that by attending tonight. So thank you very much. And the census, this is kind of a personal thing with me. I have a lot of concerns about what's going on with the census. And I don't think it's getting much PR, and I don't have time to talk about it, but check out what's happening with the census. I think there's a lot of concern about readiness, because we're at 2018, the census needs to be completed in 2020. And that may sound like a lot of leeway, but it really isn't. A lot of the work that is normally done 2 to 3 years in advance is lagging, as is the funding. So keep an eye on the census. And of course, follow along through all these resources and watch what's happening with the redistricting process. Educate others. My intention here is and our intention is to help you learn, and we hope that you will spread the information to others. Talk to family, talk to friends. You can help with the census if you want to. A lot of people don't realize that. You can volunteer to help do the census. And people like Jorge, who are really good, you can do your own maps. There's software programs out there. If you are a tech person who likes doing that, go out and practice drawing some maps. Maptitude is one of the software programs. There's others, but I'm not my thing, so I'm not into that. But that's another possibility. But I want to focus primarily on these last two things. Please join the advocacy groups. And that would be League of Women Voters. Thank you very much. I hope you'll consider it. I know I'm being pushy here, but at least get on our email list. But we really do need your support. We take men. It's not just women, not women only. So, and there are many advocacy groups. Support the advocacy groups. House parties, I'm not going to get into because we're out of time, but there is that link on our website to learn how to do a house party. To, again, spread the word, and they're also called conversation circles. The 4 of us that I introduced, Sharon and Barb, myself and Lucy, are available to go out to your groups to speak to you about, and it's a much shorter version when we go out to your groups, so you don't have to listen to me for that long. And if they go, it's really nice and concise. But we are happy to do that. We are all volunteers, so it depends on our schedule, but we'll try to work. We can go to neighborhood groups, we can go to your church groups, we can go to your hobby groups, whatever you like. But we're happy to do that. And now what I want to spend some time on is the last one. Because we always talk to people about having hearings, going to your legislators' hearings when they have them, asking them to have them. The best thing to do is to get to know your legislators, get to have a personal relationship with them. They are working for you. You need to utilize that, utilize them. Call and write your legislators. Okay, we're going to get into specifics later. Not much later, but a little later. I think we have to get back to acceptance of diversity of opinion. We have to come back to talking to one another We have to suppress those amygdala responses. And so then I started thinking, okay, let's look at it as a coin. And one side of it is, what do I want from my political representative or political candidate even? And then the other side is, what's expected of citizens? Well, if anybody read the editorial, what I want from my political candidate is I want somebody who has basic education. I don't know why we think that, you know, somebody should just be able to run for office knowing nothing about the basic requirements of the job. Governing does require some skills. I mean, you wouldn't go to a doctor who didn't have any medical background. You don't want me doing your plumbing just because I know what a wrench is. Trust me, I know nothing about it. So we want basic education. We want somebody who's got some frontal lobe development, who's got some maturation, and can think logically and can reason. And we also need somebody with people skills, who can bring people together, who can generate consensus. And we also need someone who is ready to dedicate themselves as a public servant to the public good, not looking for power, not looking for money. My representative, what are your goals? Well, we all have the same goals, right? Good jobs, good health care, good education. I think that's pretty universally agreed upon. Where we disagree sometimes is on the policy. And the policy is what's important. You need to know what the stepping stones are, what that person believes, that candidate believes will get us to the goal. So when I talk to a candidate or I talk to my representative and I ask them, what is your policy to generate new and better paying jobs in my district? I don't want to hear, I'm going to get more jobs. I'm going to get good jobs and they're going to pay well. You know, that's like going up to a contractor building a house and saying, gosh, I love that beautiful house. How did you build that? Tell me specifically how you built it. And the contractor looks at it and says, that's a blue house. That's what I call my whoop-de-doo moment. You know, it's like, who cares? You've already, you know, it's like, yeah, I know we want good jobs. Yeah, I know we want good schools. I want to know what you're going to do, what steps you're advocating, because you're my representative, or you're potentially going to be my representative. Anyway, I'm talking way too much, and I apologize for that. But what I want you to think about is what you should be asking your legislator and what you should be accepting from your candidates and then from the people who are already elected. And I would argue it's not okay to just accept cliches. We need to have higher expectations than that. It's not okay to just accept these generic, you know, la-di-da, whoop-de-doo ideas without any specifics. You need to ask and pay attention to policies. What are the specifics that this person represents? That's the only way you can really make a legitimate decision between and among candidates. So I hope you'll consider that when you do your activism, which is what I am going to move on to now.
We've got to go activate.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I had a few people, I don't know, maybe I should just skip this now that I've kind of talked so long, but let me go on to, this is actually my last slide. But I was going to go on the website and actually take you into the iga.in.gov so that we could actually look up this committee. This is the action I'm requesting you to do because, like I said, there are no bills yet, but we have these committees that have been working over the summer, and the Interim Committee on Elections is the one that will be dealing with any redistricting efforts. They're also dealing with voting issues and things like that too, which you may be very interested as well. Unfortunately for us, they are having their final meeting tomorrow morning at 11:30, and they're turning in their final report then. So we don't have a lot of time here, but I would really like to urge you to contact Greg Walker. He is the chair of the committee, and ask him, tell him that you want this committee and the current the new legislator to pursue redistricting reform. This is that iga.in.gov website. This is the state website that I told you about. Look how cool this is. Okay, now check across the top. You can click on information, you can look at sessions, you can look at committees, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to find the election committee. Okay, so I'm going to click, watch what I'm doing. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, I'm in committees, and now I'm going to go down to the interim committee, because this is an interim committee. And look, voila, now I have the House, the blue ones, on one side, and I have the Senate ones, the red ones, on the other side. So I'm going to scroll down because this is a House committee. And by the way, whenever you see HB in front of a bill, that's a House bill. The Senate bills will say SB. So I'm going to scroll down, and we want the Elections Committee, the Interim Study Committee on Elections. And here we go. And if you look on the left side, you can see the chair is Greg Walker, Representative Milo Smith, who, by the way, was the chair who blocked the vote on the 1014 House bill in the spring. And then you see the Senate members and the House members. You can then click on them. So let's click on Senator Greg Walker. And again, I always want to do Vanna, voila. You get Senator Greg Walker, and here are all his, here's all his information. So that's where you get your contact information for him to answer your question. There's the phone numbers there, mailing address. You can also look and see all the bills he's been involved in. If you go over here, if you want to, you can see every committee that he's on. You can visit the caucus page, which are those caucuses I mentioned before, the Freedom Caucus and Progressive Caucus. So does that answer your question? This is how you get it. I'm going to leave it up for a little bit. But it should be on your green. Oh, no, it wouldn't be on your green sheet, I don't think. No, because this is a committee member. But this is such a cool website. There's just all kinds of information on here. You can look up laws. You can look up publications. If you look at the upper right, you can just type. You can find your representatives this way. All kinds of great information on this website. I'll just leave that up. If you have time, go ahead and call all the members of the committee. That would be wonderful. It's not good enough to just register to vote and say, I'm done, did my part. That's not enough. We need, because we really are the checks and balances. Everybody says, well, we have the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch. We've got a lot of checks and balances, and we do. That's a good thing. But we, the people, are the main check and balance in our country, and we can't renege on that duty. These are some tips to help you when you're making your phone calls. And I did not write this. This came from the Indiana State Chamber of Commerce, one of those good things that they have on their website. Identify clearly your subject, state why you're concerned. This gives you some how-tos to make your phone calls. So I'm not going to go over it all. You can read it, but refer to it. It also has some do not do's. Don't do these on the bottom. Don't be disrespectful. Because, I probably sounded very critical today about about the legislators, but actually I'm pretty empathetic. Running for office is horrific, and I think most of us are aware of that, the money, the time, the energy, all of what's required to run for office. But being in office is tough. This is not an easy job. And it's real easy. It's always easier to sit back in any situation and say, I would have done this. They should have done this. It's always easy to criticize. But what I want you to consider, and that was what I was trying to get to in the personal part of this, is look at the attributes that you need for someone to be successful in that position. Vote those people in. And then help them. Because, they've got all kinds of topics and bills and things, and they've got people on all sides making demands of them. I think we have to be respectful of the difficulty that entails. And we shouldn't have this animosity between us and our representatives. We are supposed to be together. They are supposed to be representing us. We are a team. And I think what we've gotten to is a very adversarial type of situation in our whole political climate. And it's up to us to try to change that. Our children, our grandchildren, all the future generations deserve better than what we have presented and what we have today.